Welcome to the Good Grazing Makes Sense video. I'm here today with Paul Meiman, and our subject is 3 things academia would like producers to know. Paul, I hear a lot of times that there's a disconnect between producers and what academia is doing, and I'm kind of in both sides of things, or at least I chat with a lot of academics, and I can see where the disconnect may lie. A lot of times academia has a really good point to make, but has to put together a 10-page paper to get that one good point across. And today I'd just like to just narrow that focus down and pick your brain about 3 things from your point of view that you'd like the producer to know from the academic side. Paul, you want to give a brief background?
Okay, so I'm Paul Meiman. I'm an extension range management specialist with University of Nevada Cooperative Extension. It's a statewide position, and I'm lucky to be based in Elko in Northeast Nevada. Some great rangelands, working with some great people. I think you're spot on. I've kind of been working in this area for a number of years, and I think that disconnect, it's a real thing. And I probably see it more from the side of academia, but I try to keep an ear to the ground, for messages from our producer partners. And I think there's an awful lot of wisdom in the words of ranchers, and so that may be one of the keys to helping to bridge the gap. I think for a while our whole model has kind of been maybe too one way. We kind of think academia should be going to the ranchers with the information. And I'm encouraged, though. I have seen some pretty significant moves in my career to have ranchers a lot more involved in research, and the voices of ranchers and the wisdom therein get more recognition and more time in the spotlight, if you will.
One of the aspects we hadn't thought of when we started Good Grazing Makes Sense is not just to get information out to producers, but academics. More than one had reached out and said this would be a great avenue for producers to tell us what they want to know about. And I know we've personally had conversations like that where you may have adjusted some of the things you're interested in to make sure you're getting the information that the producer wants out there. So what's the first thing?
Well, I'll start off. I'm pretty relieved that that little short 3-letter word, the, wasn't before 3 things ranchers need to know as part of my assignment, because that relieves a lot of stress for me and gives me a lot more leeway. If it was the 3 things they needed to know, then boy, pressure would have been on. I would have had to, prioritize what are the top 3 things. I don't even have to rank them. So thanks.
What a great academic move to pick out the semantics of the 3-letter word, the. Good start.
I'm a word nerd. And the other thing I thought of is, I appreciate, I asked Dave this, and I appreciate his response. I said, I don't know how good of a job I'll do representing academia as a whole. So this is, I can only speak for myself. I've worked in academia for quite a while. But again, I can really only represent myself. So I appreciate Dave said, well, that's what we want. We want your perspective. And so that's what I plan to give you folks today.
Absolutely.
So I thought of 3 things. So the words of ranchers that I chose to use for thing 1 is, and I quote, grass is much more than cow food, end quote. Begin the second quote, it takes grass to make grass. So these are some of the first things that came to mind when Dave asked me to participate in this. And again, these are things that I think the vast majority of ranchers already know, but they're good things to keep in mind and remind ourselves of from time to time. And to provide a little context and emphasize the importance of this, the first part of that, grass is much more than cow food. Those are words that were spoken to me by by a rancher who's younger than me by a little bit, very intelligent individual. Started going to a lot of extension programs about grazing management and ranch management and economics. And we were out on his place one day, and he said, I kind of hate to admit it, but the way I was trained and the emphasis that existed in my background and training, I really had never thought before about the growth needs of plants. I really was thinking about grass and forbs and other plants just as food for herbivores. And those words were important because it represented a real turning point for this individual. And it's just like opened his mind to all the things that, range management types talk about relative to grazing management and plant growth. And so I really appreciate him saying, um, once I admitted and said the words, grass is a lot more than cow food, that's when I really started thinking about the growth needs of plants. And then the other part of that, it takes grass to make grass. This one I got secondhand. So I was listening to a presentation from another rancher who has a PhD in something like geophysics. I mean, whopping intelligent guy. And he was actually talking about one of his neighbors, who was a very experienced rancher, and actually had a picture of this individual sitting in the saddle on a horse. Um, this experienced cowboy may have weighed 85 pounds soaking wet. And there's that quote, it takes grass to make grass. And it just, it hit a home run. All the academicians talking about the importance of residual and leaving material for the plants to work with and to protect the site and to provide habitat and all these other things. That individual nailed it in, what is that? It takes grass to make 6 words. And it's like a marketing slogan. So, those are just 2 small examples of a lot of wisdom in not that many words spoken by ranchers. And so they just nailed it, and so I use those things, and I think they're, because they're words of ranchers, they resonate with ranchers. I just really appreciate those 2 bits of wisdom. What I want ranchers to know is that some of us in academia know that there's a lot of that their words are wisdom packed and that we should listen to them. And I want to encourage ranchers to continue sharing that wisdom. So rancher friends and colleagues, keep it up. Keep our feet to the fire. So my thing too, kind of where I've ended up, I really think more and more that a great way to approach grazing management is that, think about it as it's all about distribution. It's distribution of grazing use across a piece of land, and it's distribution of grazing use through time. Either way, it's all about distribution. And so some people think about and have heard about time and timing of grazing, and that's pretty popular. So time is kind of the duration piece, timing is kind of the season piece. Of the big 3 factors that influence how grazing management affects plants, you've got season, duration, and then some measure of intensity. Those are the kind of the main things. And then under that duration, that can affect frequency. That's another one that's commonly discussed. So the number of times that an individual plant is grazed. I think those are kind of the time-tested major factors to think about when it comes to the growth needs of plants. They need an opportunity to grow. Those leaves, especially, but the green parts of plants, especially leaves, are the solar panels of plants, or the solar collectors. That's because plants make their own food. It's that green material, actively growing leaf material, that's really important to plants. So there needs to be some period of time when there's enough of that out there that the plants can make their food. So that can be growth before grazing happens, or it can be growth or regrowth after grazing happens. But just thinking about some period of time when plants can grow, when they're not just constantly losing their above ground material. And so that kind of gets into the other parts of duration, how long animals are there, and then intensity, which often is a matter of how many animals per unit area for how long. So, and then if we think of those periods of active growth, different types of plants are growing at different times of the year. I think ranchers are paying attention. They know when plants are actively growing and when they're kind of shut down or dormant. So just thinking about giving the plants a chance to do their thing at some point during the year without constant grazing.
Yeah, and knowing the difference between what's growing at what time. What I was thinking the take home message would be, I mean, it to me, it's coming back to that time, and intensity. Did you say distribution across time? Is that kind of your headline there? I like the
Yeah,
way that sounds.
that's how I wanted to handle the timing part or the season part.
Yeah. Can you go back to frequency? We brushed across it, and frequency is one of those. I think one of the most important things when we're talking about distribution across time.
Yeah, so frequency is the number of times that an individual plant is grazed in some period of time. Usually we're talking about during the growing season. And you're right, there's a lot of emphasis on frequency, and for good reason. I mean, that gets right to what I was talking about, in that if plants really never get a chance to do their thing in the absence of grazing, that would suggest that there's a pretty high frequency
Yeah.
of use.
How long before the second bite on the same plant is what it comes down to, right?
I'm not the biggest fan of the second bite. Let me qualify that. It matters more in areas with a little more moisture and an extended, active growth period. So a lot of our riparian areas where there's a water supply and plants will have the ability to regrow for a longer period of time, maybe most of the summer, as compared to uplands, where really a lot of our upland plants, especially in arid and semi-arid parts of the West, the window of time when there's enough moisture and the right temperatures for growth and regrowth, it's a pretty short window. The foundational research that is often used to come up with an estimate of how long it takes between bites, basically, is based on, there being enough regrowth to be attractive to the herbivore coming back to take another bite. And you have to make some assumptions about how fast the plants are growing.
So is your issue with just second bite being too generic? Or are
Well,
we still talking about the same thing? Um, it's just the amount of time to recover from a grazing uh, instant, a bite.
what I've been advising folks, I mean, this resonates with people, and so it's good. I'm never going to take a tool that people are interested in using and say don't use it. It doesn't make any sense. So what I've gone to with people who like this idea of a second bite or trying to avoid a second bite is, rather than use these cookbook equations to tell you the number of days, just use your observation of the animals on the landscape, and if you think there's too many plants getting a second or third bite, move on. But don't get too closely tied to the estimates of 10 days or 14 days, whatever it may be. Because the other part of this is there's no guarantee that if a plant regrows some amount that we think is going to make it attractive to a second bite, that they're going to go back and get a second bite. You may have animals spread out across the landscape enough that they're not actually going back and taking a second bite. So there's some neat work out of Arizona on looking for the second bite and when it happens. And I guess what really stood out to me with some of this work that's come out more recently is it was a surprising low number of plants that were actually getting bitten a second or third time. So when we think of pretty extensive rangeland management, if 11% of all the plants in the plant community were getting a second bite and 30% of them were getting a third bite, you still have 70% that just had one or two bites, and 80 some percent, pushing 90%, that just had one bite. So
That's pretty interesting. But the take home there is, um, just want to kind of bring it back. Distribution across time is the take home for thing two.
throughout my career, um, repeatedly, we come down to the situation where there are kind of these problem spots, and it's like, especially when you've got a landscape where part of the country is really attractive to livestock, and part of the country is a lot less attractive to livestock. And so I like distribution because, if you just say time and timing, or time, timing, and intensity, um, you can think about those things. Well, there's a danger that you could think about those things without that kind of spatial context. And if you have distribution, it's like, all right, I need to really think about where my animals are on this chunk of land at what time of the year and how are they going to move around as I'm thinking about the growth needs of the plants and plant communities.
How about thing three?
So thing three, so I think a lot of us are pretty interested in science-based management, in concept anyway, and a lot of folks in academia like the idea of doing science, doing research that can support management. So I thought it would maybe be helpful to provide our rancher friends a little insight into the world of academia. And what came to mind was the fact that there's really not too many scientific papers that get published about no differences. But a study that is designed well and implemented well, but yields no differences, can be pretty darn important to management. So the challenge here is that if scientists can't get those papers published, they don't get out there and you don't hear about them that much. And so there's a tendency to try and do research that results in differences. Yeah. And oftentimes these need to be done in a pretty short time frame.
That's interesting. I never really thought about that from the academic side, but if I'm budgeting, say supplement A costs 10 cents more per head per day. What's the difference between supplement A and supplement B? It's the no difference that I'm looking for. If there's no difference, I'm going to go with the cheaper one. And I didn't realize how often no difference affects management decisions.
So think about this. You could have a study where you've got one approach to grazing management, which would be considered good management, effective management, hitting your production goals, hitting your natural resource goals. Okay. And then over here you had some form of ungrazed, right? So if you had no difference between something that had been protected and something that had been grazed with good management, that's exactly what you're talking about, right? It'd be pretty important to know, gosh, I could do that. And
so just in case somebody's driving and listening, Paul put quotes around protected. I just want to make sure everybody's clear on.
Thanks for that. I appreciate it. You got my back. But those types of deals are hard to publish, and so this is like inside baseball for you ranchers. If you're hearing a presentation or somebody's telling you about a paper, you're reading a paper about, I'm going to do the quotes again. Thanks, Dave. The effects of grazing. Listen up and see if they were comparing an exposure to something else. And knowing that it's hard to publish no difference, the something else might be grazing that's managed in a way that you're not going to manage grazing, because they needed to show a difference between grazed and ungrazed, which in my opinion is a false dichotomy. So I was trying to think, so what? What would the take home be for ranchers? And I guess I started with a little bit of that, but ask questions, challenge researchers, keep us honest, and then it's kind of a big favor to ask, but those of you who can and are willing, please get involved with research and help these researchers who have an interest in doing good stuff, help keep us out of trouble. I know you've got a whole lot going on, but if anything you can do to help keep my colleagues and myself out of trouble would be appreciated.
What are some ways producers could do that?
Well, I think there's quite a move, and I alluded to some things that make me optimistic that have been happening through my career. There's this approach to science that is co-production. And so if you hear co-production, if it's something you're interested in, ask a little bit more about it. But basically what it is managers, including researchers, being involved with scientists to produce science. There's user-driven science. Something else we've used for a long time is applied research.
How do you think that's viewed by the public? Because my immediate thought is that's great to get producers involved in that science. How do we keep that honest? I really like that direction, but how do we make sure we keep that honest and ensure the public's trust in that kind of science?
So you're never going to totally avoid the possibility of people thinking that it's cooked, right? The bottom line is we talk a lot about unbiased research. Well, humans aren't unbiased. And so there is no such thing as unbiased research. So all you can do is just be transparent. Say, here's what we did. Here's who was involved. Here's where the money came from. I think the opportunities greatly outweigh the potential challenges.
I agree. Transparency is probably just our best option on that.
I think there's a lot of good research that gets done. So it's not all junk science, like the oversimplifying grazing down to a false dichotomy of grazed and ungrazed. But there have been some doozies out there. I had a colleague call me years ago about a study. They wanted to simulate the effects of some kind of cattle grazing in riparian areas. So they went down to the riparian area with a chainsaw and cut out all the willows. And that was how they simulated cattle grazing in a riparian area. And there you have it. They're going to have an effect to report.
Yeah, there's just a great example right there. Having a producer on the ground would have shut that down immediately.
Yeah.
So 3 things from one academic's point of view that you'd like ranchers to know. And I got thing 1, from the academic side, listen to the producers and take part in their wisdom. Number 2, distribution across space and time, kind of a spin-off of time, timing, and intensity. And thing 3, we got some inside information onto how the science works and some caution to think critically on those things. Work with the science and work with the scientists. Does that sum up your 3 things that you'd like producers to know, Paul?
I like it a lot. I think you did a great job. And I just restate those words of wisdom from ranchers that grass is more than cow food, and it takes grass to make grass.
I like those ones a lot. Grass is more than cow food, and it takes grass to make grass. Well, thanks for joining us, Paul. I want to also thank our sponsors, the Bureau of Land Management, United States Forest Service, and the NRCS for sponsoring Good Grazing Makes Sense and help getting programming like this out to you. So thanks, Paul, and until next time.
Thank you, Dave, and thanks to the sponsors.